Dr. Leo Vance sneezed for the 12th time in as many minutes, his body shuddering as he fumbled with the seatbelt restraints of the descent pod. He reached for a tissue from his pocket, only to discover, with a resigned sigh, that the last one had been used up somewhere around Mars. Earth's last, best hope for interstellar colonization, and he couldn't even conquer hay fever, descent in 30 seconds, the automated voice chirped from the console, its cheerful tone contrasting with the ominous shaking of the pod. Great. Let's just hope this thing doesn't turn me into a smear on the landscape, Leo muttered, his voice muffled by the tissue. He pressed a few buttons to check the atmospheric entry parameters. The readings were not reassuring. Outside, Xylar 9's atmosphere roiled in brilliant shades of green and yellow, the turbulence shaking the tiny craft like a leaf caught in a gale. As the pod punched through the thick, corrosive clouds, the planetary surface came into view. A sprawling alien landscape spread out below, pulsating violet fields of what looked like bioluminescent moss, towering crystalline spires that refracted light in rainbow arcs, and a vast, shimmering sea in the distance. The terrain was breathtaking. And utterly lethal. Leo barely had time to admire the scenery before the pod jerked violently, slamming his head against the seat's headrest. A series of loud alarms blared, drowning out his frustrated groan. Perfect. Of course, the landing thrusters would malfunction now, he grumbled, gripping the controls. With a mix of desperation and guesswork, he managed to steer the pod toward a relatively flat area. The impact was bone-jarring, but the pod held together, more or less. Smoke billowed from the vents, adding to the chaos as Leo scrambled to unbuckle himself. Welcome to Xylar 9, he said to no one in particular, coughing as he shoved open the hatch. Population, one idiot scientist who probably should have read the fine print. The first thing Leo noticed as he stepped onto the planet's surface was the smell. A pungent mix of sulfur and ozone assaulted his senses, making him gag. He tapped a button on his wristband, activating a small field generator that created a breathable pocket of air around his head. A faint humming noise accompanied the device's activation, and the smell diminished enough for him to focus. The second thing he noticed was the gravity, or lack thereof. His first cautious step sent him bouncing several feet into the air, and he landed awkwardly on his backside. Okay, note to self, practice walking before trying to run, he muttered, brushing himself off. Surveying the area, Leo began unpacking his equipment. The Space Colonization Bureau had provided him with state-of-the-art gear, modular shelters, atmospheric processors, and enough dehydrated food to last a year. But as he set up his base camp, a nagging thought kept surfacing in his mind: this is insane. You're insane for agreeing to this. You're a biologist, not a pioneer. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The planet's ecosystem was what mattered now. And the gene modification implant embedded in his arm was the key to survival. Leo activated the implant later that evening, after double-checking his camp's defenses. The process was straightforward, or so the Bureau had claimed. The implant would analyze Xylar 9's environment and gradually reprogram his DNA to match its challenges. In theory, he would evolve faster than any organism in Earth's history. In practice, he had no idea what to expect. The initial changes were subtle. Over the next few days, Leo's breathing grew easier as his lungs adapted to filter the planet's thin, toxic air. His skin thickened, becoming resistant to the abrasive winds that carried microscopic shards of crystalline dust. By the end of the first week, he could see in the dim twilight that passed for daytime on Xylar 9, his eyes adjusting to the alien light spectrum. At first, these changes thrilled him. He kept meticulous notes, documenting every detail in his journal. Day 8, he recorded one evening, his voice filled with cautious optimism. Preliminary adaptations are progressing smoothly. No adverse effects. Beginning to feel almost comfortable here. That feeling didn't last. On day 11, the first sign of trouble appeared. Leo had ventured out to collect samples from a nearby ridge when he noticed something odd about his hands. The skin wasn't just thickening, it was changing color. A faint, iridescent sheen covered his fingertips, catching the light in a way that reminded him of the planet's native vegetation. He flexed his fingers, watching as the strange shimmer seemed to ripple with the movement. "Okay, that's new," he said aloud, his tone more curious than alarmed. He made a mental note to analyze a blood sample later. The changes didn't stop there. Over the next several days, his reflexes became unnaturally sharp. He could catch falling objects without thinking, and his sense of balance improved to the point where he could navigate the uneven terrain with ease. On day 15, he discovered he could hold his breath for an extraordinary length of time, over 10 minutes, while investigating a submerged cave in the nearby Sea.at. First, Leo chalked it up to the implant doing its job. But a nagging doubt lingered at the edges of his mind. The changes felt off. They weren't just adaptations to the planet's environment. They felt alien. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt on day 20, during a routine exploration. Leo had ventured into a dense jungle of towering, spiral-shaped trees, cataloging samples of the strange flora. He had just finished taking a sample from a glowing blue vine when he heard a low, guttural growl behind him. He froze, heart pounding, as he turned to see one of Xylar 9's apex predators, a massive, insect-like creature with serrated claws and glowing red eyes. It was crouched in the underbrush, ready to pounce. Instinct took over. Leo raised his arm in a defensive gesture, expecting nothing more than a futile attempt to shield himself. But to his shock, his forearm transformed. A sharp, chitinous spike erupted from his wrist, catching the creature mid-leap. The impact sent it crashing to the ground. Writhing in pain, Leo stumbled backward, staring at his arm in horror. The spike retracted as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace of its existence. He glanced at the predator, now retreating into the jungle, then back at his trembling hands. "What the hell is happening to me?" he whispered. Back at camp, Leo reviewed his notes and blood samples with increasing urgency. The data was clear. His DNA wasn't just adapting, it was incorporating genetic material from the planet's ecosystem. The shimmering quality of his skin, the enhanced reflexes, the spike, these were traits borrowed from Xylar 9's native species. He tried to rationalize it. The implant must be malfunctioning, he told himself, pacing the small confines of his shelter. But deep down, he knew the truth. The implant was working too well. It wasn't just rewriting his DNA to survive. It was turning him into something else. For the first time since arriving on Xylar 9, Leo felt genuinely afraid. He wasn't just adapting to the planet. He was becoming part of it. As the days wore on, Leo found himself increasingly drawn to the alien landscape. He stopped wearing the breathing field, finding the planet's air strangely invigorating. He began understanding the subtle rhythms of the ecosystem, the way the bioluminescent plants pulsed in sync with the planet's magnetic field, the intricate dances of the predator-prey cycles. It was as if Xylar 9 was speaking to him in a language he was only beginning to comprehend, but with this newfound connection came an unsettling sense of detachment. Messages from Earth went unanswered. The comforts of his human life, his favorite books, the music stored on his datapad, felt distant and irrelevant. Each day, his reflection in the mirror looked less familiar. By day 30, Leo could no longer deny the truth. He wasn't just a visitor to Xylar 9. He was becoming one of its native inhabitants. Leo awoke to the sensation of something brushing against his arm. His eyes fluttered open, and he found himself staring into the translucent, multifaceted eyes of a creature that could only be described as a cross between a dragonfly and a house cat. It tilted its head, studying him with an intelligence that felt unnervingly familiar. He didn't recoil. Instead, his hand moved instinctively, brushing over the creature's smooth, chitinous surface. It didn't flinch. If anything, it seemed curious. For a moment, Leo wondered how it had bypassed the perimeter defenses he'd set up around the camp. Then he remembered, he hadn't turned them on the previous night. At some point, he had stopped seeing the creatures of Xylar 9 as threats. He blinked, realizing that even his initial jolt of surprise felt more like waking from a dream than true alarm. The creature chirped softly, a sound halfway between a bird call and static crackle, before skittering off into the bioluminescent jungle. Leo sat up, the faint light from the moss-covered ground casting shadows across his modified shelter. His fingers grazed the back of his hand, feeling the faint, smooth ridges that had begun to form beneath the surface of his skin. Not for the first time, he wondered if this transformation was something he should fight. A week ago, was it only a week, he had been terrified of what was happening to his body. But now, as the mornings bled into surreal afternoons, he felt lighter. Less tethered to the things he had been so desperate to hold on to when he arrived. It wasn't just his appearance that was changing. His thoughts, his instincts, even his sense of self, were evolving. He was part of the world now, not an intruder. Still, there was one thing he couldn't let go of: the mission. Not the Bureau's mission, they would be content to turn him into a glorified lab sample, but his own. If Xylar 9's ecosystem had taught him anything, it was the delicate balance of life here. Whatever humanity planned for this planet would upend that balance in ways no implant could fix. He pushed himself to his feet and stepped outside. The air was warm and tinged with the sweet, metallic scent of the jungle after a recent rainfall. Above, the massive crystalline spires that pierced the sky reflected 1,000 colors, creating an aurora that danced across the horizon. It was breathtaking. And it belonged to something far older than the human drive to conquer. Leo tapped his wristband to bring up the communication log. His messages to Earth had gone unanswered for days. It wasn't surprising, the Bureau had likely deprioritized his reports in favor of planning their next steps. After all, they had what they wanted: proof the implant worked. Proof humanity could thrive here, except humanity wasn't thriving. He was. A movement caught his attention. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the rustling of the towering trees in the distance. Then he saw it, a group of Xylarans, their iridescent bodies blending seamlessly with the surroundings, emerging from the jungle. They moved with the grace of predators, their elongated limbs barely making a sound as they approached. Leo's chest tightened, but he held his ground. He had seen them before, always at a distance, watching him. They were intelligent, of that he was certain. The bioluminescent patterns that flickered across their skin seemed to be a form of communication, one he had yet to decipher. Until now, they had shown no sign of aggression. He hoped today wouldn't be the exception. The lead Xylaran stepped closer, its luminous patterns pulsing in slow, deliberate waves. Leo raised his hands, palms out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The creature paused, its head tilting as it studied him. Then, to his astonishment, it extended one of its arms, thin, delicate, ending in fingers that looked almost human. Tentatively, Leo reached out and touched its hand. The connection was instant and overwhelming. Images and emotions flooded his mind, fragments of memory, bursts of color, a kaleidoscope of sensations he couldn't fully process. He staggered back, clutching his head as the Xylaran withdrew its hand. The others stood still, their patterns shifting in unison as if waiting. When the dizziness subsided, Leo found himself breathing heavily. "You're trying to tell me something," he murmured. His voice sounded foreign to his ears, his throat raw from the effort. He pressed his hands to his temples, trying to make sense of the mental torrent the Xylaran had triggered. Images of fire, of broken spires, of creatures fleeing into the void. It was as if they were showing him their fears, their memories, and then he understood. They weren't just watching him. They were testing him. Seeing if he could bridge the gap between their world and his. Leo knelt, lowering himself to the ground in a posture of submission. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, unsure if the words even mattered. "But others will come. They'll destroy this place if I don't stop them." The lead Xylaran stepped forward again. Its fingers brushed his temple, and this time, the connection was less overwhelming. A single, clear thought emerged from the chaos: "You are not like them." The Xylarans stayed with him for hours, their presence both unsettling and oddly reassuring. Though they communicated primarily through touch and light, Leo began to sense a rhythm to their patterns, a logic he could almost grasp. By the time they melted back into the jungle, leaving him alone once more, he felt a strange clarity. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of this planet now, its caretaker. The next morning, Leo dismantled the perimeter defenses he had once painstakingly constructed. He didn't need them anymore. The creatures of Xylar 9 no longer saw him as a threat, and he had no intention of treating them as one. Instead, he focused on building something new, an interface, a way to communicate with Earth that would force them to listen. He repurposed the technology in his shelter, combining it with the organic materials he had collected from the planet. The resulting device was crude, a fusion of human ingenuity and Xylaran biotech, but it worked. His first message to Earth was simple: the implant works, but the cost is too high. Xylar 9 isn't just another resource. It's alive. And it's watching us. He wasn't sure if they would believe him. But as he looked out over the alien landscape that had become his home, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Leo's message to Earth went unanswered for days. Each morning, he woke to the same silence, the communications device blinking expectantly as if mocking his efforts. He wasn't surprised. If he'd learned anything about the Bureau, it was their ability to ignore inconvenient truths. But the Xylarans didn't seem to share his frustration. They returned to him daily now, watching from the edges of the clearing, their bioluminescent signals pulsing in slow, deliberate waves. By the end of the week, the lead Xylaran, whom Leo had begun calling Ash, after the silvery patterns on its skin, ventured closer. This time, it brought something with it, a small, crystalline object that glowed faintly in the dim light. Ash extended the object toward Leo, holding it in both hands like an offering. He hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. The moment he touched it, his mind exploded with light. Memories, not his own, but ancient and raw, flooded his consciousness. He saw the world through alien eyes, the rise of the crystalline spires, the delicate balance of predator and prey, the slow, steady rhythm of the planet's life. He felt the first pangs of fear as foreign objects descended from the sky, bringing fire and ruin. He understood, with a visceral clarity, that the Xylarans saw humanity as a threat, not just to themselves, but to the fragile harmony of their world. When the vision subsided, Leo found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. Ash stood over him, its luminous patterns pulsing faster now, almost agitated. "I understand," Leo whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're trying to protect this place. And you should." Ash tilted its head, the glow of its patterns slowing as if in response to his words. For the first time, Leo felt like he was making progress, not just in understanding the Xylarans, but in aligning himself with their purpose. The crystalline object in his hands felt warm now, almost alive. It was more than just a memory device, it was a bridge between their worlds. Later that night, as he sat by the faint glow of his camp's remaining lights, Leo turned the object over in his hands. It seemed to pulse faintly, in rhythm with the planet's distant magnetic field. He realized then that the Xylarans weren't just showing him their history. They were giving him the means to fight for their future. The next morning, he began modifying the communications device. Using the crystalline object as a power source, he fused it with the remnants of his human technology, creating something entirely new. The device now emitted a low hum, resonating with the frequencies of the planet itself. It wasn't just a transmitter anymore, it was a message in itself, a signal that would carry the truth of Xylar 9 to Earth in a way no one could ignore. He composed his final message carefully, recording every word with a weight he hadn't felt before. To the Bureau and anyone else listening, Xylar 9 is not a colony. It's not a resource. It's a living, breathing world with a balance we can't begin to understand. If we invade, we'll destroy it. And it won't go down quietly. As he sent the message, the device emitted a sharp, crystalline tone that echoed through the clearing. The Xylarans emerged from the jungle, their bioluminescent patterns flickering in what Leo now recognized as curiosity. He smiled faintly. "I hope you understand what I'm trying to do here," he said, even though he knew they couldn't understand his words. "It's not just your planet I'm fighting for. It's ours too." The response from Earth came faster than he expected. 2 days later, the sky above the jungle erupted with the unmistakable roar of engines. Leo stepped out of his shelter, shielding his eyes as a sleek, silver shuttle descended, its landing thrusters kicking up a storm of dust and debris. He could see the Bureau's emblem emblazoned on its hull, stark and utilitarian against the organic beauty of the landscape. The Zolarans retreated into the shadows, their patterns dimming as they watched. Leo's heart pounded as the shuttle's hatch opened, revealing a figure in a sleek, pressurized suit. The figure stepped forward, their helmet retracting to reveal a face Leo recognized immediately: Dr. Elaine Graves, head of the implant project and the person most responsible for sending him to this planet. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "You've caused quite a stir back home." "Good," Leo replied, crossing his arms. "Maybe that means you actually listened." Graves stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning him. "We received your transmission. And your enhancements." Her gaze lingered on the faint iridescence of his skin, the subtle changes that marked him as something no longer entirely human. "Impressive. But it doesn't change the fact that this planet is our best hope for colonization." Leo took a step forward, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This planet isn't a blank slate for us to exploit. It's alive. And if you don't respect that, it'll fight back." Graves raised an eyebrow. "You've become quite the idealist, haven't you?" "This isn't about respect, Dr. Vance. It's about survival." Leo felt his temper flare. Survival at what cost? Destroying an entire ecosystem? Wiping out an intelligent species? We've already done that once on Earth. Do you really want to make the same mistake here? For a moment, Graves said nothing. Then she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You think you're the first person to argue this point? The Bureau doesn't care about ideals. They care about results. And right now, you're the only thing standing between us and the results we need." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Leo clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't fight the Bureau on their terms. But maybe he didn't have to. Turning, he looked toward the jungle where the Zolarans watched, their patterns flickering faintly. He had one last card to play. "I'm not alone in this," he said, his voice steady. "If you try to take this planet, you won't just be fighting me. You'll be fighting them." Graves followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly are they going to do? Glow at us?" Leo smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised." At that moment, the jungle came alive. The bioluminescent patterns of the Zolarans intensified, spreading through the trees and casting an eerie, otherworldly glow across the clearing. The ground trembled as the crystalline spires resonated with a deep, melodic hum. It was a display of unity, a warning, and a promise all at once. Graves took an involuntary step back, her composure faltering. What is this?" "This," Leo said, his voice calm, "is the planet telling you to leave." The standoff didn't last long. Graves, for all her authority, was just one person. She couldn't make the decision alone. After a tense exchange, she agreed to return to the Bureau with Leo's message, and the Zolarans' silent warning. The shuttle lifted off, leaving Leo alone once more, but this time, he didn't feel alone. As the jungle settled and the Zolarans returned to their watchful silence, Leo stood tall, his transformation complete. He wasn't human anymore. He wasn't Zolaran either. He was something in between, a bridge between two worlds, and the first step toward a future where both could coexist. The story of Xylar 9 wasn't over. But for the first time, Leo felt like it might have a chance.